So our next panel is just that. I'm Laura Reif. I'm a partner at Greenberg Traurig. I'm the former chair of the National Immigration Forum Board, and I currently am president of America is Better Board. And I'm honored to be here today and be walking the halls of Congress with all of you. And it is an interesting time. I had a bit of PTSD when I was looking at what I was going to say to introduce this panel this morning when I thought about 6 years ago when I was chair of the board and woke up to the election news 6 years ago. How were we ever going to navigate immigration reform and policy issues that are important to this group with the past administration? We have a little bit of that kind of soothsaying and looking in our crystal ball today. We are honored to have Linda Chavez with us today. Linda worked in the Reagan White House, and she is a Republican strategist. She is a senior fellow with the National Immigration Forum. We have Jonathon Jones, who's a managing partner of Tiber Creek Group, who has worked across the aisle, a Democratic strategist. And we have our moderator today, Suzanne Monyak, who used to be at Law 360, a reporter there. She is now with CQ Roll Call, and I would follow her on Twitter. I do. She covered an incredible press conference yesterday that many of you attended on DACA. And we're really delighted to have all of these folks here to talk about how we thread the needle on immigration reform with these really tight races. As you heard, the Senate is going to be held by by Democrats. We have one runoff, and the Republicans did just take the House last night. I think the AP did call it. We still have 8 races left, but it's going to be a difficult needle to thread, and we're looking forward to having the discussion today, so thank you.
Thanks so much for that nice introduction, Laura, and for the Twitter bump. It's obviously been an eventful couple of weeks, so I'm excited to get into this. I'm going to start with you, Linda. Obviously, we just came off of midterm elections where border security and immigration was a big topic. How did we see immigration and conversations about immigration playing out on the campaign trail, and how did it go?
Well, first of all, I think from my point of view, immigration is and always has been a very, very difficult topic to get unanimity or even a bare bipartisan majority in getting bills passed. But I will say that one of the comforting things about this past election is although immigration was used as an issue in some of the races, particularly by some of the candidates who were election deniers and sort of on the far right, it wasn't the most salient issue. It was nothing like 2016, where you had this very broad populist movement who somehow believed that the United States was being invaded, that our borders were absolutely open. And as I like to remind people, this came at a time when illegal entry into the United States was at an almost 50-year low. Now we actually do have a lot of at least attempted border crossings. We had an historic high during the last year. And yet the issue is not striking that kind of populist chord. I think that does give us an opportunity, but I'm going to be looking to the lame duck Congress and see if, while the Democrats still control both houses of Congress, they can get some sort of a narrow agreement on at least a couple of issues. DACA being, I think, one of them, because there is bipartisan support to allow dreamers to have a pathway to legalization and eventual citizenship, but also in some of the agricultural workers, where I think even the Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, comes from an area that's got agricultural interests, and there are a lot of Republicans who frankly understand their constituents need immigration reform. They'd like to see it done while the Democrats are still in control so they don't get blamed.
We're going to definitely get into lame duck in a little bit, but while we're still on the election, I want to turn to you, Jonathon. There was a lot of speculation about a shift among the Latino voter electorate toward Republicans. That was something that party had made an effort to court those voters. How did that go for them? Did we see that shift?
Yeah, I mean, we did a little bit. I think actually you've seen the shift occur over the last the previous two elections, and it continued from what we know. I mean, it's a little early to really know exactly what happened. We'll have a better picture in about 2 months or so when we get all the data and we're able to look at it. My guess is that the margins will probably be a little bit tighter than what we're seeing now in terms of Republican pickup, in terms of Latino voters. But there's definitely what we're seeing now is maybe a 4 to 6 point shift nationally towards Republicans in this election, and that follows pickups that Republicans made with that constituent group in the last two elections, frankly. I think the good news on that, though, is I agree with Linda 100%. I mean, the good news in all of this, and there's some concerning news as well, but the good news is that the immigration issue did not play nearly as strongly as we had anticipated, as the Republican Party had hoped it would, and as it has in the past, in previous elections. I think for a lot of these Latino voters, I think the economy was a much bigger issue for them. And, that there's a lot of hope that a lot of those voters come back if the economy improves, for example, or the issue becomes less salient. But I mean, the economy and inflation was an enormous issue. And I think what we'll see when we see the final results on this is for minority groups and lower income voters, that was the issue, like by far. And I think that really that probably skewed the data a little bit. And really, ultimately, and this is no surprise, it's been reported widely, I mean, independent voters really bailed out the Democrats in this election. They offset those gains, I think, and more that Republicans made, simply because I think independent voters just felt like the threats to democracy, the chaos, the extremism, particularly from the party and also from the candidates they fielded, was more important to vote on than the economy and inflation. And so, we have a little bit of a mixed bag, and I think part of the trick is how do the parties read their elections, and oftentimes, I'm a Democrat. Oftentimes, I feel like my party misreads that. I think probably Republicans feel the same way, and I worry that Republicans will look at the last 3 elections and feel like, oh, we're making real progress with these voters, while we're also highlighting these really extreme immigration positions. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how they react to that. And similarly, Democrats will feel really good about how they did. They could easily say, look, we've stopped the bleeding with these voters. It was more the economy. This is a really winning issue, and they could, go too far, which they've done in the past. So I think, these parties are kind of pre-wired to read elections wrong and to overcorrect. And so I think that's the thing. If we can keep this thing in the middle of the road, I think Linda's right. I think we have opportunities.
And I want to pose this to you as well, Linda. Obviously, the Republican Party, in some of their efforts to, pick up more Latino voters, did run some prominent Latino and Latina candidates. How did, those people fare, and to what extent can we read into that?
Well, it's very interesting. Part of the advantages of having the white hair is that you've been around long enough that you've been able to see this happening. And Jonathon, it's more than the last 2 elections. I wrote a book back in 1991 called Out of the Barrio. And in it, I chronicled the political movement of Hispanics in the United States. And what was clear as early as the Nixon election in 1972 was then we didn't lump everybody together and call them Hispanics. It was Mexican-American voters. But Mexican-American voters in 1972, about a third of them voted for Richard Nixon. And you saw that number expand during the Reagan years, so that in 1984, President Reagan actually got over 40% of Latino votes. And then we had, the whole immigration issue emerge, and the Republicans do a lurch to the left. But again, George W. Bush did very well with Latino voters. So I think, Jonathon, you hit the nail on the head. When the Democratic Party looks at Latino voters, they tend to think, oh, gee, immigration is going to be the issue that we're going to hammer home. We're going to be the party of, pro-immigrants, and we're going to paint the Republicans as the anti-immigrant party. What they don't understand is, first of all, the heterogeneity. It's not a homogeneous group. Hispanic voters aren't all one group. They're divided ethnically. They come from 24 different countries. Their history in the United States is very different. We were talking at breakfast this morning about, my roots. My family came here in 1601. They were part of the Spanish colonists who came then to what was New Mexico. And the border crossed us. And thanks in part to one of my ancestors, Manuel Armijo, who was the last Mexican territorial governor of New Mexico. He gave up that 1/3 of Mexico in the war with the United States. So there's great variability. But the issue of the economy and how Hispanic voters are faring in terms of jobs, in terms of their opportunities to open businesses, in terms of what they see as their opportunities to move up the economic ladder, will always be the most important issue in voting. And if they believe, as some of them did, that their opportunities expanded during the Trump years, you're going to see some of them move more to the right on that issue. In this last election, there were many more Hispanics running for office as Republicans. Some of them won, some of them lost. It was really a very mixed bag. You had some very close races in nearby Virginia. Congresswoman Spanberger had an Hispanic opponent who was not able to defeat her. But on the other hand, you saw, in places like Oregon and other places where Republicans actually did much better. So it's I still think that Hispanics as a group more reflect the experience of other immigrant groups to the United States, and that is as they move up the economic ladder, they are more likely to move to the right politically. But the Republicans have, in my view, done their best in recent years to try to push them away with really inflammatory rhetoric, and certainly that is not a good thing.
Right. I'm now going to hop to Congress, which is why we're all here. Obviously, like Flora mentioned, the House was called last night, so we're looking at a lame duck where the Democrats know they're losing the House, and then into next year, a split Congress. So I want to put this to both of you. What are your thoughts on prospects for, getting anything done first during lame duck, and if not, into the new year? I'm going to start with you, Jonathon.
Well, I think it's easy to be negative, particularly about lame ducks, because usually the word lame is there for a reason. But I think there's also reason to be optimistic. I think just this room alone is reason to be optimistic. The reason you guys are here today, the reason there was 4 other groups here in Washington, hundreds of meetings on Capitol Hill, is because I think everyone understands the critical importance of trying to get something done at this moment before we have a split Congress, next Congress, where I think it gets a little tougher. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I think that there's a lot of stuff lining up against doing a deal, and time is one. The fact that there haven't really been any significant conversations is another. I think those are starting. They're starting this week, which is a good sign. We'll see how far they get. I think we still have an undecided election in Georgia, which I think makes people a little reticent. Senator Klobuchar mentioned that she was hopeful on her bill that conversation would start after that runoff, which is not great. It'd be better if we knew now, because we'd have more time to really get serious about working on this. And the issues aren't easy, right? I think Republicans feel a little bit emboldened, particularly in the House. I think there are going to be a large number of House Republicans, including some that are elected, that will put pressure on the new Speaker-elect to wait and not do a deal, that they'll have more leverage in the next Congress. I've talked to a lot of Democrats on the Hill this week who feel that they're hopeful, but they're really cautious because they don't believe and they don't trust that Republicans will meet them where they are. They know they have to give. The good news is that I think from the Democrat perspective is they know, and I think the advocacy community knows, that in order to get a deal, major concessions need to be made. What Linda described, the Democrats are going to have to come, to the middle and maybe even put a foot or a toe a little bit into the, over the line to get a deal. And asylum is going to be the big trick. I think Democrats are very comfortable doing a pretty good border security package. It would be acceptable. The asylum stuff's really tricky. And I've talked to a number of Democrats who say, I don't know, depending on what the price is on asylum, I don't know if it'd be worth it for, a million legalizations, which is what we're talking about, 1.2 million or something like that. I mean, Linda would know better exactly the numbers. But, so that's the dynamic. And, right now, these kinds of efforts are critical because first you have to kind of like fill the balloon with air before you can get, before you can make progress, and putting pressure on members, that this is the time, this is the moment to strike, that everybody's willing to work together. The more extreme elements of the advocacy community kind of are moving to the middle. So the dynamics are all there for a deal. The willingness on the part of Congress and the interests, the political interests of the House Republicans, I think, are the big unknowns at this point.
I think that's exactly right, and I think you also hit the nail on the head when you talk about asylum as being the big issue that's going to be the stumbling block. Look, I am very supportive of the people who are coming here, particularly the people who are coming from such long distances like Venezuela. I mean, I can remember when Republicans thought it was a great thing when you had people fleeing from a communist regime and seeking opportunity in the United States. We had the wet foot, dry foot rule back in place, and if once you got to the United States, if you happened to be coming from the island of Cuba, you had automatic refuge here. But the fact is, when you have as many people who are flooding to our southern border and the total inability to be able to process these people, to be able to get them beyond just a few miles from the border, I think what Ron DeSantis did and what some of the governors are doing in terms of busing people away without any kind of coordination with the jurisdictions where they're going to be sent is disgraceful. It's a political stunt. On the other hand, I don't think that you can have 1 million people who've just been admitted in the state of Texas, in areas like El Paso, which are simply not equipped to be able to handle them. The refugee program has always operated to disperse people around the country because it was always believed that there would be a more successful integration if you did not have everybody bunched together in one place. But you did send them to places that were prepared, where there was a community to be able to support them. So there needs to be some effort in terms of looking at our asylum laws, which tries to put into effect rules that are going to be good for the security of the United States, but also good for the incoming asylum seekers. But it is going to need some compromise on the part of Democrats. I think the current system isn't working. It clearly isn't working. And the people who are coming, many of them are political asylum seekers and would fit under the original category, but many of them are not. Many of them are people who are just trying to feed their families. And frankly, the best thing we could do for them is to fix our legal immigration system, come up with a way for people to be able to apply and come to this country and be able to do it in a more humane and efficient manner. And the question is, can you get a few people in the room the way we used to be able to, and certainly have done in the Senate, in the House, and try and come up with a compromise? I do think that DACA is something that's got to be dealt with, but I'm also a little pessimistic and worried that until we actually see some DACA recipients with the court cases, going all the way up to the Supreme Court and basically losing the protections that they have, if they face deportation, I think that's when you're going to see the kind of crisis which may in fact move people. And until then, it's easier just to pretend the problem doesn't exist because people are here and are working, et cetera.
I want to jump to what you said about the way we used to be able to get, lawmakers together on these issues. Obviously, you've, worked in politics back decades. Do you think there is, I guess, like a pro-reform lane for immigration in the Republican Party still? And sort of how has the Republican Party shifted on immigration over the years? Is there enough interest and incentive there?
You know, it's very interesting that if you talk to members in the Republican Party, I can remember a conversation I had, I won't mention the congressman's name, but he was part of the Freedom Caucus. And when I was in a green room with him at CNN, we had a discussion, and he was very frank and said, look, I know we need to have legal immigration reform. And he, again, was from an agricultural area, needed workers. They will say that to you privately. The problem is you have groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform. Stephen Miller has, ran ads during this last campaign, ran them during the World Series, Citizens for Sanity, he called it, really vicious anti-immigrant ads. Once those people get riled up and they rile up the base, then it becomes impossible. So, I mean, it makes the work of groups like the National Immigration Forum so important. They need to hear from you. They need to understand that you live in their districts, that you represent a different point of view, and that you vote, and that they will pay some consequence if they don't move on this. It really does get down to who runs the better PR campaign, who's the most effective group lobbying, and unfortunately, the right has been more effective on this issue in recent years than we've been able to be.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about DACA, because you brought this up, and obviously this is sort of an elephant in the room over, all immigration negotiations. The DACA program is in court right now, could potentially be struck down permanently in the next 2 years if it goes up to the Supreme Court, which I think is probably likely to do. Jonathon, I want to start with you. To what extent do you think that's going to influence negotiations? Is that something that you think could be enough to spur action during lame duck to avoid, DACA being struck down while Kevin McCarthy's leading the House?
Yeah, I think Linda was right, actually, in pointing out that, a lot of times we govern by crisis in this country, and coming off of an election where Republicans increased their share of Latino voters, and you've got a new speaker who's a very tenuous position, I think it's hard. What you're going to need is the Democrats are there. I think the Democrats at this point are willing to do significant asylum reforms and significant border security paired with DACA, but also they would want, something for TPS workers and ag workers, and probably something on STEM visas, which is really important, a really important national security issue. And there's actually, I think almost everyone agrees with it except for one senator from Iowa. So we should be able to get that done. But the Senate is the place where you probably need everybody on an issue like this. So I think that it's going to come down to whether or not there are enough Senate Republicans that are willing to say, to conclude that it will look bad enough for us, right, if this case is struck down and they're deporting Dreamers in advance of the 2024 election, which is not entirely clear that that'll be the timing. If that's the case, and I think Linda's right, privately there are a lot of Republicans who would do this deal in a minute. Publicly, it seems a lot less clear to me. And again, it comes down to Kevin McCarthy and whether, will Mitch McConnell allow that deal to happen. The other piece you've got on the Republican side, and Linda can speak to this too, I'm not a Republican, but John Cornyn was a key figure in cutting deals on this issue and on others. And honestly, the gun deal he helped negotiate in the last Congress cost him a lot of political capital inside of his own party. He is trying to position himself to take over for Mitch McConnell when he leaves. A lot of his conference did not like that deal that he cut. And it was much more optics than substance. But, I think he's a true kind of moderate. He's much more in the mold of McConnell, maybe even a little more like a McConnell, Ted Kennedy type figure in the Republican Party. But that's not really playing well for him now, so he has to kind of step back a little. That's a big problem on the Senate side. It means like Tom Tillis or someone like that has to come forward. Durbin is there. He's the leader on this in the Senate. They did a press conference yesterday. Some of you probably were there. He was very good. Others were a little more inflammatory, but Durbin was good. And I think Durbin will be the one to pull the bipartisan group together in the Senate that Linda talked about after the Georgia runoff. The question is how many Republicans show up, and can they actually stand behind what they commit to in that room when they walk out to the podium?
Could I just add one thing? one of the groups that I didn't mention that I think is absolutely vital to making this happen are employers. I know, the Chamber of Commerce, all of the big employer organizations are with us, and they do, see this as a priority, but they often don't put their money where their mouth is, and they don't put it to the top of the list. And I can tell you, as somebody who sits on a corporate board of a large company that employs a lot of immigrant labor, that we understand that what is hurting our business is the lack of people out there willing to do the work. We are facing a horrible labor shortage in the United States. So I think employers have to step up. If the Citizens for Sanity can be running ads during the World Series, why aren't the employer groups out there talking about the labor shortage and talking about the immigration crisis that we face? Because we are in a legal immigration crisis in this country. We simply are not admitting enough people legally to be able to allow the U.S. economy to grow, and that has got to be brought home to employer groups.
Kind of related to that, the Republican Party has sort of historically been seen as having pro-business interests, and as you mentioned, employers are facing labor shortages, and they're saying, like, we need more, foreign professionals, we need more visas, whatever it may be. Do you think that that provides incentives for Republicans to act on immigration, whether it be DACA, because we're afraid of seeing hundreds of thousands of people lose their work authorization if the program is struck down, or even more highly skilled programs, as we're talking about, employment-based green card caps and some of those more narrowed, more targeted issues? Is that incentive enough, or are the incentives coming from somewhere else?
I do think that it applies pressure, but I think a lot of people, when they think about worker visas, they do think about the STEM workers. They think about, bringing in more engineers and chemists and, mathematicians, et cetera, all of which we do need. But we also need people who clean our buildings, who do landscape work, who put roofs on homes. So we need to have visas available, not just for people at the high end of the skills spectrum, but we also need people who are at the lower end of the skills spectrum. And coming up with something that gives some notion that we do have an immigration system that is more modern, that does look at U.S. needs, because that is, in my view, the only way you can sell immigration reform. You're not going to sell it just on humanitarian basis. You're not going to just sell it on nostalgia, and this is our past. You need to make it in the interest of the American people that we bring more people here. And I think employers could help make that case.